Hi class, it's Bill Berry with the last, I promise, video in the Getting Started with JavaScript series. That is our second week of class during the normal quarter, and there is one small topic that we needed to finish, and so we are going back to our topic on forms. So let me jump to that slide. And in the previous video, we talked about setting up a form, what they are, of course, and we looked at the HTML required. We looked at how to set these things up with inputs, and the input type text is what we used for this particular thing, and then we also created a button for submit, and the form looked something like what you see on the screen here. And we also looked at how we would get to that data, and that also talked about how to glue the form to the function that we wrote. So in the form, for instance, let me grab a laser pointer here. In the form, we wrote onClick equals show data. Notice that's part of the button, right? So we said when the user clicks this button, which is called submit, because here's the name, the value that goes onto the button, which is here. When they click that button, run the function called show data, and you know it's a function because you see the parentheses. So that's how we set up the form and how we glued together the form with the function. Now let's look at the function real quickly. By default, remember, you can access the form by using the fields numbered, right? The numbered or indexed fields. So the first one becomes item 0. That's what modern languages mostly number things, starting at 0. So this is the 0th field, this first field, and second, and etc. So that's how we're going to access them when we run that function. So let's look at that, right? So here in the head section, notice the reason we typically do that, get it away from the body, because the body's usually full of HTML and other kinds of good stuff, so kind of put it out of the way. So here in the head section, we have a script, and in the script, we have this function that we wrote called show data. We write the word function, show data, open curly brace, close curly brace, and then inside all the code that belongs to the function, usually again indented because it's easier to see that that stuff is all part of the function. And in it we use the document object model to grab out what we wanted. In this case, document.customerData, which is the name of the form, and then by default, again, there is provided for you an elements collection, which is all the fields, all the things that are part of the form. That probably includes the buttons too, but we don't usually talk to the buttons much. So we're going to use .elements, notice the S, and then a square bracket, and then the number of the item that we're interested in. In this case, we're interested in the first one, which is numbered 0. So we grab out the 0th item's value. Remember, elements 0 is talking about the actual field. We don't want the field, we want its value. We want the text that's in the field, so we put .value to complete it. And all that stuff is analyzed, evaluated. It brings back that value and stores it in a variable that we are creating here called custName. So whew, that's a lot to say, but that's how we get this data into variables. The point of that is that we can then manipulate it, right? We can use it in alert, we can use it in calculating, we can use it in concatenation and display, whatever we want to do, but it's in our hands now in variables. So that's what we did last time, a quick review of that. What we want to do this time is see that there's another way to do this, and that is, this is kind of icky. Yes, you can do that, but what if you rearrange the form? You'd have to go rearrange these and figure out which element went with which variable again. There's probably a better way to do that. There are two approaches to do that. One is by naming things, and then there's another one is by giving them IDs. Well, IDs are fine, but why not just a name? Why don't we name them something that makes sense, and then it's a lot easier. So we're going to go back to our form. Let's jump back over to this guy, and then I'm going to also bring up, so what we're going to do here then is we are going to give these things names instead of numbers, right? So down here, I'm going to add something to the end of my input. After type equals text, by the way, do that first, right? Do type equals text first. Don't try to name it first. Then you're going to say name equals, and then you're going to give this particular thing a name. Now I'm calling it name, not very creative, but it works. So in this case, this is where the customer name goes, so I'm calling this particular field name. You do that by using the name attribute, then putting an equal sign, and then in quotes give it some sort of name. Again, these are not exactly JavaScript variables, right? This is creating a name in the DOM, the document object model, but still I would use normal kinds of naming rules. Don't try to put spaces and things like that. So I'm going to do the same thing down here with the phone number. So the name of the field is going to be phone. All right. So now I've given these two input fields in the form a name, and I can access them now by name instead of by index, which is again more convenient and I think just makes more sense to your brain. And if you rearrange the things on the form, it doesn't matter because they are all named. So how are we going to change this stuff up here now? Well, instead of having to use the elements collection, we can replace that with the name from the form. So in these cases, I can change this elements 0 to name and elements 1 to phone. We still need the dot value because we still want to pull out the value that's sitting in the box that the user typed, right? So that's all. That's all we have to do. Name and phone are the names we use down here, and then here we use those same things in the document object model. Now, notice I didn't change anything about my variable names because these names are completely separate ideas. You could use the same names for these down here in the form and then the same things for the variables, but I think that confuses your brain. It would work technically, but I think it's best to separate them so that your brain knows, hey, I'm really working on something different here. So I would name these one thing and then name your variables another thing so that you're kind of clear on the distinction between them. And again, the document object model is our friend. We start at the document, drill into the customer data form, drill into the name field, drill into that to get its value, right? Now, later we're going to maybe peek at this a little bit, and that is that when you put all these dots, this is indicating that you're treating all of these things as objects. So when you see this kind of notation with lots of dots, you think, oh, I'm working with an object. Yes, you're working with the document object model. The document is an object, and these periods are drilling down into the object to get deeper and get things out. So just a word that, a clue that that's what's happening here. All right, so that really brings us to the end, but let's save it just so we'll make sure that it actually runs. So let's launch it in Firefox. We should see the same thing here. Joe Schmo, and put Joe's phone number. And when we hit submit, we should see an alert for the customer name and an alert for the phone. Now this form doesn't really do anything too exciting, but it does prove something exciting, which is we can write HTML, write a form in HTML, and then we can go access that data, which means that opens up the possibility that we can do a lot of cool stuff. So as soon as we have a couple more tools in our toolbox for the language, we can start writing more interesting scripts that manipulate this, and indeed we're going to do that very soon when we study selection. So back to our slides. That was a quick summary of what you see here in the slides, right? So this shows you how you can use the name. These are color coded to try to help. So now we give these things names. Next slide talks about how to use that, and that is just replace elements and the index with the name and the phone, which are the names that we gave in the form. So that shows what you need there. All right, so in class, of course, if you attend the class, we're going to do some challenges to that to kind of prove that we can do that, and you can apply what you've learned by changing the form to look like this. And so we'll do that in class. There is another slide here that just gives you some things that you can follow up on. Forms can be super cool. You can do lots of neat stuff with forms. So I'm just giving you some little clues here that that's true. Instead of type equals text, try type equals password. And what you'll get here is a password fill-in, which doesn't show on the screen what the user is typing. Even has, depending on the browser, you might even have this little show me my password icon. You can also do larger text areas, and if you didn't just want a little thing where they can type a little bit of stuff, you can give a big long thing where they can type like a description or a feedback or something like that, and it's called a text area. So instead of an input, you're going to use a text area. There are more input types that are interesting. You can use a reset, just like there's a special type for submit buttons, which we didn't use, but there's a reset one, and when you click that, it's going to reset the form back to its defaults. which is kind of cool. This one is also very nice, and that is to any kind of your normal text elements, you can add placeholder equals value. So remember that default actually puts that text in the box so the user sees it, and then if they want to erase it, they have to go select or type over it, right? But placeholder is just this little hint. So if you use placeholder equals and then you put something like Joe Schmo, then what the user sees is this little kind of ghosted text that shows that, and then they don't have to erase it. It's not a real thing. It's just there to kind of hint to them what's going on, and I'll show you that before we move on. So let's just jump over and look at that real quick because I really like this one. So let's say name equals phone, and then that's before or after, it shouldn't matter. I'm going to say placeholder equals Joe Schmo. And then I'll do the same here. I'll say placeholder, because what you're doing here is you're showing them the format that you want to use for the phone number. So if you really want them to enter it like this, that gives them a darn good hint that that's what you want. So watch what this does. Firefox is a great one to try these things in because it has a little more functionality in a lot of ways when it comes to forms. Launch in Firefox, and notice here the placeholders are there, but they're kind of ghosted, and as soon as you start typing here, Jill, whatever, Jill Jacobs, then the ghosting goes away as soon as you start typing. But you've given them the idea, right? So they know exactly what to do. They know the format that you're asking for, and that's called a placeholder. And of course, everything comes in just as before. So that's pretty cool. All right, and then there's some other things down here that just says there's a myriad of other interesting things you could use in a form. Checkboxes, radio buttons. There's a way to do email entries so that it knows that it should have an @ sign. You can have things that let the user pick, either type in and make sure it is a valid date, or it comes up with a date picker, a color picker, a file picker. There's a way to restrict the entries so that they're only numbers, right? That they're going to accept numbers and not text. That's pretty darn cool and very useful for us. So many of these things, and those things are all going to be linked here. So let me show you the quick resource slide, and that is to say there are tons of things that you can do if you want to learn more about forms. First, I've listed here the Draw.io tool that I use to create some of these flowcharts, and that's a free tool and it's not bad, so check that out. And then there's a lot of links on forms. I like the ones that are in the W3 schools. This is one of the best sites in terms of getting good resources for HTML and I think even JavaScript, but it's one of the better ones. So there's lots of information about forms and the different input types, and then getting really specific about the element attributes that you can use within those. So you can get super specific, and there's some more that you can find here. So as promised, this is the last video in this particular series, and then we'll start in on some cooler stuff, and we'll keep going as we move through the quarter at learning new tools that let us write more interesting programs and take more realistic scenarios and turn them into JavaScript code, which is the key. And so I promise that's coming next. That takes us to the end. So if you have questions, please send them in, and we will either talk about them in class, or you can post them in email or in one of our discussion forums, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can certainly put them questions in on YouTube. So thanks for watching this video series, and look forward to seeing you in the next one.